Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Lights on Data show. I'm your host, George Firican. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on how EdTech and AI are converging to transform higher education, from that big picture strategy all the way to the recruitment and the retention to make sure that we have all the students that we need. So, the global EdTech market is forecast to hit $404 billion this year. And of course, AI is powering everything from predictive retention engines and much more around this content. And to help us navigate this new landscape, I'm thrilled to welcome Emily Chase Coleman, CEO of HAI Analytics. Emily, great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, let's start with a broad view before we kind of zoom into the specifics. From your vantage point at HAI Analytics, how are edtech innovations and AI coming together to kind of reshape institutional strategy and that student experience?
So I think there are a few different ways. Most higher ed institutions are using predictive modeling, which is sort of the precursor of AI, and AI involves predictive modeling as well. And they're using it for, a whole variety of things, including recruiting the class, as you said, retaining students. And I think those are the big ones because there used to be such a focus on just getting students in the door, but there's more and more realization now that we want the students to succeed. I mean, we always
Mhm.
wanted the students to succeed, but that kind of wasn't thought about at the enrollment piece at that stage. So now more and more schools are using predictive modeling, not just to predict the yields or the admit to the enroll yields, but also the student retention and then they do different things with that. So we're looking at, financial aid optimization, what financial aid packages do students need in order to be successful, early intervention with, any sort of risk factors that are identified. And we can even build predictive models, of retention before with just pre-enrollment factors so that schools can know before the student even arrives on campus, are they at risk for not retaining, not being able to stay, and then they can be really kind of proactive about that. One of the cautions that we have around it is now with the really powerful AI models and machine learning models, we see this kind of movement to just kind of throwing all the data into a powerful model and then looking at the output and letting that tell us what the factors are that are important and the drivers of the different behaviors we're predicting. And we know that that can be very dangerous, that there needs to be kind of a human component to that. So HAI stands for human and artificial intelligence, and that comes from our vantage point that someone needs to be thinking about the data that go into the models and
Hmm.
someone needs to be interpreting what comes out. Even though we have these amazing, powerful models, just leaving them to sort of do this on their own can be dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. So let's talk about the first part that I mentioned on the retention and the completion. And I love that they're on top of mind for provost and dean these days. And I mean, I think they should have always been, and maybe once they figure out the whole recruitment strategy, this was inevitably the next step. But I mean, I can definitely see why. You definitely want those students to get their degree, boast about it, hopefully get a job, spread the message forward as well. And I would also imagine there's a economical component to it, that it does take quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of money to recruit, so that once you have the successful recruitment, you want that individual to complete their years up until they get their degree too.
Yep, that's absolutely true. It's less expensive to keep a student who's already enrolled than it is to recruit a new student. And higher ed institutions realize that now. So of course, everyone we work with, they truly care about the students,
Mm.
but even if we're looking just at the financial bottom line, it makes sense to kind of have a better handle on retention.
Yeah. And in a way, it's sort of similar to the employee retention and things like that too. For the most part, it
Mhm.
makes most sense to retain your employees than keep on hiring new ones.
Yep.
So on that end, have you encountered any specific AI powered analytical model that maybe just delivered the biggest improvements in those retentions and the completion rates?
That's a good question. So, one example of a model that I worked on was many years ago with a law school, and we were predicting bar pass rate. And so US lawyers have to pass the bar exam in order to practice law. So, once we had that model, we could see that there were factors that were predictive of success in terms of the curriculum. So, students opting for courses that weren't as challenging. So basically this law school kind of revamped its curriculum, and they moved their bar pass percentage up by like 20 percentage points. It was just a huge improvement for them and for the students. So we do see examples of that, especially when a school kind of starts predictive modeling or using these technologies to look at retention. There can be really a huge improvement at the very beginning.
Are there maybe newer, different data points that AI is using then and its modeling that would differ from what you've seen so far?
Mm. Yeah, so the big thing now is we're sort of able to track like every move that a prospective student makes, and every time they come to the website and what they do on the website and which pages do they stay on for more than a certain number of seconds. So
Just
those
to
are
kind of
all.
gauge their interests and
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So those can all be used, yeah, in a yield model to identify interest and a student's likelihood to enroll. And a lot of our clients ask us to include those factors, and we do. Those factors became more complicated with COVID. So prior to COVID, one of the biggest predictors of interest in the university was if a student visited before they, enrolled. Then everything shut down and students couldn't visit. So we started looking at this kind of ping data and all of the online activity of the students, but then realized that that had really spiked because the students couldn't visit campus. So it wasn't like it could just sort of, we didn't, using the past ping data didn't predict the current, what students were doing now, because they sort of had no choice. But once we can kind of identify those pitfalls, we can figure out the best way to include data like that. And it is, it just expands beyond the data available, expand every year. And schools also use some third party geodemographic data. So looking at like the US Census and what are the neighborhood descriptors of where the
right.
student comes from. And that's something that we have seen over the past 10 years really become a bigger part of the predictive models that institutions are using.
Makes sense. I want to ask you something about the interest and getting all that data from their browsing history and what they're clicking on and interacting with on the website. Is that harder and harder to get now with Google's kind of moving away from the third-party cookies and how that's being tracked? And I understand that's starting to be a little bit more challenging too.
Mhm. I think it is. And that is sort of, I mean, we hear that from our clients. We don't, it's not our area of
Yeah,
expertise, but yes, you're right. And it changes every year. So if you don't have that consistency from one year to the next, it's hard to include that factor in a predictive model. And there are all sorts of reasons, including what you just mentioned, why those data are not consistent from one year to the next.
definitely. So, Emily, something that has always fascinated me in higher ed is how collaborative these institutions are with each other. So, they collaborate on many different things. Of course, there's a competition there going on as well, especially when they're competing over a similar territory area. But have you seen them kind of share some of this data or insights or lessons learned between them and even data points?
Yes, yes. So in terms of data points, there are some groups of institutions that, they're similar institutions, they do compete, but they kind of form this consortium and will share data on like, are your application numbers up this year? So that other schools can kind of gauge the market. So that is one way that we see the data being used in that way. we find, we often present at conferences on the work that we do. And oftentimes we ask our partners, our clients to present with us. And, everyone is willing to do it. I mean, it
Hmm.
isn't, we all sort of have the same goals. And yes, there's competition, but there really is a collaborative spirit, I think, in higher
Hmm.
ed, which is great because, one institution figures out something that works and then they share that and it kind of makes the entire process more efficient.
Definitely. All right. I want to talk about the H in HAI.
Mhm.
So, where does that come in your process?
Where it comes in is when we are thinking about the data. Well, so first of all, one of the most challenging things that uh, piece of the process that we do with our clients is just getting clean and reliable data. So, some institutions, their data are impeccable, most they aren't. And so we have to figure out, is a campus visit coded, or is the same type of visit coded year after year? And we have to make sure we understand the factors that are going into the model. And then we have to look at, what makes sense to put in the model. So just the easy example of COVID, where we used to have campus visit in the model, we knew that year we need to take that out. We can't just let the model run on its own. That factor is still in there. Um, so that's where on the front end we see that human component. We also, we're working with our partner institutions to develop financial aid strategies that are effective. So we're, take their enrollment goals and retention goals need to be taken into account when the models are developed. So we're not just saying, we could just design an econometric model that would determine the financial aid each student gets. And then you'd have, if you visited campus, you get less, or any of your interest factors, you would give less money to. There are no institutions that do that. They want to sort of support the students rather than make it just a business. And then on the other end, once the models are built, there's a lot of interpretation that has to happen. We have to look at, okay, we're looking at the strength of the model. Are there any potential biasing factors in it that
Hmm.
we haven't, thought of? We work with the institutions to get their feedback on, this is what the model is telling us. Does that fit with what you're seeing on the ground? The clients are the experts in what they do. So we don't discount that expertise. We like to sort of bring in the analytics that we do to pair with that to make, the whole stronger. But there's a lot of interpretation and discussion that
Right.
has to happen on the back end once the models are built.
Makes sense. Yeah. And for you to have the context from the point of view of the institution that you're working with. Um,
Mhm.
I wonder, Emily, are there any psychology factors sort of like coming into the model? So, for example, let's say that one of the data points is the fact that the prospective student is already buying some varsity type sweatshirts.
Mhm.
And yes, you can see the correlation that those that did in the past, they're more likely to enroll. But then the psychology is telling you, well, there's already that emotional bond that's being created. So it is a valid correlation that we will include in as a data
Mhm.
point. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
making
I
this
mean,
up, but something like that.
yeah, that's a really interesting one. I haven't seen anyone who was capturing that yet. Excuse me, but they certainly do capture. Well, they use things like that to try to increase the interest on the part of the students. So, every school, when they admit students, they send them something, like you're saying, they send them a sweatshirt of the school so that they can feel like they have this ownership over the institution and that they really belong there. So we haven't seen that sort of thing used in a predictive model, but and it's hard when, every year a lot of factors change, but a lot of times our institutions are trying to figure out, okay, last year we sent a sweatshirt instead of a bumper sticker. Did that improve the yield of the class? And, how do we know that? So there is a lot of kind of experimentation that needs to happen and trial and error. But I mean, I can see the example you gave being kind of the next thing down the road that,
Hmm.
that schools are wanting in their models.
All right. All right. Okay, so moving on with it with a human though, once you have the context, you've sanitized the data, you put together the model, uh, probably there's a couple of iterations and improvements along the way. Do you just hand it in? Is there Are you still involved? Is the school putting their own human into the loop? What's going on
Hmm.
there?
Yes, so we are still involved. There are different companies that do kind of what we do, and everyone has a different approach to it. We stay involved throughout the cycle, so the whole admission cycle, because no statistical model is perfect, and you're building it on the prior year's data, and things can change in the world, in the student population. So we use the models to guide the strategy, but then throughout the cycle we're meeting with the client and talking about what are they seeing. The model may be predicting that 27% of admits are going to enroll, but they're seeing campus visit numbers have gone through the roof. So they think that that is probably a low estimate. There's a lot of that happens, a lot of kind of adjustment along the way. And yeah, it's a very important relationship. We use a tracking dashboard that can be updated daily, so that we're really tracking day to day. Is this pool shaping up the way we assumed that it would when we built the model on last year's data? And if it isn't, then we can sort of make adjustments along the way, both in terms of financial aid packages, admission strategies, number of students admitted. That all kind of has to be monitored throughout the cycle after the model is built.
Very interesting. I wonder, by looking at all these past institutions that you work with, have you seen any interesting patterns? For example, the distinction between the Eastern colleges versus the Western colleges, and you'll already know that when you're interacting with someone from the West, it's, well, maybe we should pay more attention to these data points instead.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. We have seen that if you look at schools in California, particularly in the last 7 years, they are more popular than a model would perhaps predict. So, it's a desirable place for students to be. So when we're looking at, model results, we may know for a California school, we're going to underpredict what this yield is, and we need to kind of boost it. And again, we rely on them for that. And then the opposite is true, where there are schools that are sort of always fighting against the location that they're in, maybe isn't as desirable. And so different efforts have to be made there in order to recruit their class, both in terms of, admit numbers and financial aid and connection to the student. So yeah, there definitely are differences that we see, and it does change. I mean, California has been really popular for the past few years, but we do see shifts there where suddenly, students become more interested in the Southeast or some other part of the country. It's interesting, and it's hard to predict, and it makes our job complicated for
As
them.
you were mentioning these things, I was wondering if weather was a big factor
Hmm.
of the enrollment and the timing of it, and sometimes, obviously, that's, I mean, always, that's not really under your control, but
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting actually because, everybody, the belief is that if there's a campus visit day, a big campus visit day, and the weather is terrible, it impacts, the students aren't going to like the school as much, which I still believe has to be the case. But I did my PhD at Cornell University, which is in Ithaca, New York, which is a very gray place in the winter. And one year they did a study looking at the correlation between the weather and the students' likelihood to enroll. And they actually found the opposite was true, that if they came on bad weather days, they were more likely to enroll. So,
interesting.
yeah, I'm a social psychologist, so I can think up a lot of reasons of why that might be. But, and that's one study, and I don't know that it's held up. But yeah, it is very interesting to sort of think of those factors and the influence that they have on students.
That's so cool. Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, and I would imagine, yeah, it's kind of fun to uncover all these insights, and you know maybe bring your own assumptions and validate them or not, into the
Yep.
mix. That's very cool.
Yep.
And I wonder, Emily, once you do these types of modeling for the institutions at large, do you also zoom in into specific programs, into specific degrees that the universities or colleges are recruiting for? And then, of course, that can also be different than the wider institution.
Yes, absolutely. So at most colleges, some programs are more popular than others. So a lot of the modeling that we're doing is accounting for that, either by separating populations or by, putting everyone in the same model, but then making accommodations with things like financial aid that, a very popular major, families may be more willing to pay than sort of an unpopular major. So a lot of the strategy setting that we're helping with is taking that into account and is looking at individual programs or schools. Higher ed institutions, one of the challenges for them is that it's difficult to adapt to changing markets, partly because they have so many resources devoted to certain programs that they've developed. So you have buildings, you have lab space, you have faculty who are tenured. So it's hard to say, okay, education isn't as popular this year, so we're just going to shift the students somewhere else. And so that's where, we kind of come in and often are asked, well, education may not be as popular, but we need to get as many of these students as we can. And, how do we do that? And so we'll develop strategies that differ
Hmm.
from one program to the next.
Emily, something that else that I wanted to ask you, though, is what are some of the things that you're really looking forward to with all these advancements, and we can see this wonderful AI technology just a little bit more accessible to all of us. What are you looking forward to having it uncover?
I am looking forward to the marriage between human work and AI, making processes more effective, more efficient. So in the media, you read all the time about this worry that AI is going to replace humans and we won't need humans in jobs anymore. And I don't worry as much about that. I think of the example of when autopilot was first invented in airplanes, it didn't replace pilots and it never will, but it did make the flights safer. So I think that, there a lot of that will happen where AI will help us to improve our processes. It won't replace that human factor, but together those kind of two knowledge bases will be stronger than one on its own.
I love that, and I love your company's acronyms: human and AI, HAI, analytics. I mean, I think that's so fitting, and we should never forget that we need that human in the loop for all the various reasons that you went over. It's crucial, and I'm happy that it is there.
Yep. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Emily, for putting the lights on how one could use analytics to improve that recruitment, that retention, and of course, help all these higher ed institutions in the process. Really
Yeah,
appreciate
of
it.
course.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.